Welcome back, guys. I'm Rick with Achilles Heel Tactical. In the last episode, we covered sight picture, sight alignment, recovery of the sights, information processing, and in this episode, we're going to be covering trigger control, breathing, and follow through. Trigger control needs to happen sooner rather than faster. When I come up, draw, and present, I need to be breaking the trigger. The safety rules applied. I need to, as soon as this gun is oriented in a position of a downrange position, I need to be prepping the trigger. The two types of trigger presses are interrupted and uninterrupted. The emphasis here is the interrupted trigger press, incorporating weapon safety. When I drive this gun straight up and out, as soon as it clears that into that downrange area where I intend to fire, I am prepping that trigger on the way out, doing it more natural. Hands move simultaneous. As soon as I plan to engage this target, I'm prepping the trigger. This is happening sooner rather than faster in the most interrupted manner. Upon presentation, I want to be prepping this trigger and driving the gun straight to my eyes. As I pick up that sight alignment, sight picture, I cannot disturb it as I execute the shot. Now, a lot of people tell the gun when to go off, and this is why we have store owners telling us that this Glock or this gun shoots low and left. If the sights are at 12 and the bore is at 6, is it even feasible to shoot low and left? If I was to put this gun in a vise and pull the trigger straight back into the rear, there would be no horizontal deviation. So the human error element of gripping, and then the trigger control element, and then the sight alignment and sight picture element, these are all the human error exhibited into that shot. When we implement that human error into those shots, we are assuming that human error. Every round you send down range is attached to a lawyer, regardless if you're in a controlled environment on a range or you're out in society. We need to make sure we're mitigating and being as marginal as possible with that human error implemented on that perfect weapon system. So with this weapon system, if I come up and prep that trigger sooner, I then drive my sights out and I'm pulling the stops out of the trigger. Not telling the gun to go off, but instead I'm just, without disrupting the sights, pressing the trigger straight back into the rear, pulling the stops out of the trigger until it breaks. Once it breaks, we then go into the recovery of that trigger. We go into the recovery of the sights. This is the follow-through step. As far as breathing, just don't forget to breathe. We've been breathing ever since we were born. Do not forget to breathe. Breathe through your engagement. You should not have to think about breathing. All right, so those follow-through steps. If I have a good solid master grip, and I've got a good marriage, good positive stance, good positive posture, and I'm prepping and execute that round out of that trigger, as that shot breaks, the recovery or the follow-through steps are now resetting the sights down back on target, driving the sights back to the refined sight picture, staying target focused within an RDS sight, and breaking that shot again. Now, in order to do this the most efficient way possible, we need to be in flight resetting this trigger. Like I was saying, every time we touch this weapon system, we enact human error onto it. So to reduce that human error, we want to interrupt the trigger press as much as possible. Now, placement on the trigger, we want it to be natural. We want to fall onto that trigger and to be as natural as possible, breaking from one consistent joint, not two. So what do I mean by that? If you drive your finger gun towards a target and you pull it straight back into the rear, if you're pulling from two joints, your fingerprint will be looking over your dominant side shoulder. Instead, isolate from one singular joint, pulling straight back into the rear. You should be staring at your fingerprint. Now, grip size and what you modify to your gun is obviously going to dictate whether or not you can find that placement to break from one consistent joint. So as I break this trigger, I pause, I prep that trigger to the wall, I pull the stops out of the wall. Without disrupting the sight alignment, I then break the shot. Now, the follow-through step is the most important part. I want to cycle my finger back to the Sear reset, not the manufacturer mechanical reset. What do I mean by that? The mechanical reset of the gun is the click bang. As this gun cycles back, putting a new round in, you pin that trigger to the rear, slowly releasing until that audible click is heard and then felt. This is where we are falling short as practitioners to make sure we are holding ourselves accountable. We can cycle this trigger back to a Sear reset much sooner than the mechanical factory reset of that trigger. The in-flight reset. As I pause and prep and press this trigger in the most interrupted manner possible without disrupting the sights, the shot breaks on its own. The slide is then going to cycle back as we then cycle our finger forward, not hearing any click, and now reducing the amount of stops that we see in the trigger. Now, Rick, what are these stops that you are talking about? As you pause and prep this trigger in the most interrupted manner possible, bring it to the wall. From there, nice and slow, start pulling the trigger straight back into the rear from one consistent joint. You will be able to count the amount of stops before that sear is then engaged, sending that round out of the gun. Now, if I pin this trigger to the rear and I cycle this slide and I get that click bang, now bring it back to that click bang point, the factory mechanical reset of the gun, and then break it again. Notice there are still stops. What our goal with our triggers and why we are in flight resetting is to marginalize the amount of human error, or marginalize or minimize the amount of stops upon the reset. I can reset the sear and be ready to go without any stops at all. Now, finding those points takes a lot of dry fire, takes a lot of practice. When you're up and you're shooting multiple rounds, we need to make sure that we are getting and being efficient within those follow-through steps from in-flight resetting that trigger from the sear reset, not the factory mechanical reset of that trigger. So I see a lot of guys when we run and we're shooting slow, very deliberate, I hear, because it's a way of slowing our shots down and pacing ourselves. We get those click bangs. We really want to focus and build that efficiency because of what we're trying to attempt to do here is marginalize the human error. Interruption within the process, bring it back to the wall, pull the stops out of the trigger nice and slow, pull the stops, pull the stops, pull the stops from one consistent joint. Shot breaks. The recovery of this is that in-flight reset. My finger's coming slightly forward. It's staying on the trigger. My dexterity never leaves the surface area of that trigger. And I break again. Now, what we'll see is some guys will short stroke, but this is, as you fail is as you learn. This is obviously your trigger. I'm learning it. All right, from there, break. So if you're hearing a click bang, you're doing it the lowest common denominator rate, right?